Okay, I'm going to start with putting this up just for basic reading. Because most people in the U.S., and I don't know if you can read that. Okay, if not, I'm just going to read it then. It's usual, and perhaps correct to estimate in the USA 5 worker cells to the linear inch. Based on this, it's common to say there are 25 cells to the square inch, or 50 counting both sides of the frame. This would be correct if the cells were square, but they are hexagonal. And a little comparison will show that a hexagon, 1/5 of an inch across, does not contain as much surface as a square, 1/5 of an inch across. So as the hexagon contains a smaller surface, there must be more hexagons than squares in a square inch. As a matter of fact, if there are 5 cells to the linear inch, there are 28 13/15 to the square inch when you start talking the hexagon. And the difference in the surface area on a cone cell-wise is the difference between 1,000 cells and saying about 1,155 or 60 thereabouts. And so if you have deep combs with smaller narrower top bars, narrower bottom bars, you could end up with an extra 1,200, 1,500 cells per frame, more than what people are talking about, especially if the bees are sized right. Now, the next thing I'm going to go over and point out, and that was known already back in the 90s, from the 90s to 96, is contaminated wax, which has bearing on the health of hives and stuff. And scientists at Apimundi at the World Federation over there in general agree that the use of Apistan the past 10 years plus for Varroa, which was earlier started in some areas, so it would be beyond that and deeper yet, is most likely that recycling contaminated wax for the manufacture of foundation is largely responsible for the increase in residue levels. Because once the wax is saturated and you can't decontaminate it, as it saturates, it leaches into the honey. Until then, honey absorbs the contamination. And if the present usage rates back in '96 continued, the time has come when all beeswax has no value due to high residues, which a lot of people are seeing now with hives collapsing worldwide. And it was already said back then, it was over 50 plus years to decontaminate if everyone was to stop and do it tomorrow. So we're beyond that point a good decade or more already. If you're thinking from 96 to 2006, now it's 2016 going on 17, which is 20 years, 2 decades later. It's over 100 years, if not 150, to decontaminate our world now and get bees for needing clean wax and hex. And hence, we have a responsibility to keep the organic movement growing. So I'm going to be pointing out a few things most people don't point out. Okay, chemical-free beekeeping. And basically, what is needed basically for life, for animals, of which bees are livestock. You have air, water, food, and shelter, which used to be taught in schools back when you were in the primary grades already. So what would happen if this relationship with life is tampered with? How does this relate to today's world, to our honeybees? What is a whole bee concept for working bees? Well, you can't look at bits and pieces because you can't correct the problem if you don't know everything that's going on that's wrong. You have to look at the environment, you have to look at the diet, you have to look at the breeding, which is talked about constantly on the organic list that I oversee, with just straight dialogue, no game plan. How are these three parts interrelated, and which comes first and why? Well, it's the environment, because if you're not in harmony with your environment, you can't eat properly, and if you can't eat properly and you are what you eat, then your breeding stops, because what you pass on genetically where you're wrong with your body goes on to the next generation. Not that I would say that. Okay, the next is basic concepts relative to honeybees. It's a known fact that both honeybees and mites have been on this earth and have coexisted for millions of years. Parasites cannot survive if they kill their host. Therefore, they must peacefully coexist. And mites have always coexisted with livestock worldwide. And it's also a known fact that the mites, depending on where they're at in the country, have always been named by point of infestation. So, on the backs of cattle, they call them one thing grooming the hairs, where they normally groom the hairs for what's on there, eating the microbes that they put in their gut that helps infuse their gut so they can digest and everything else. And that's coexisting. Okay, in nature, in our natural system, the number of worker cells is 5 to the inch, while the number of drone cells is 4. The size of the bee is correlated with the capacity of the cell. Small cell, small bee, big cell, big bee. And this has been known for eons, and it's the difference between drone and workers. But if that's the difference with honeybees between female and male, with the drones the bigger, the females the smaller, you change the capacity of the cell bigger. If you think about it, what are you doing? Making the workers then pseudo-drones, so they take on the hits that the guys have always protected the hive from, as nature put it forth in evolution, versus man changing now to have stupid problems because bigger is better for what? Sicker and weaker. And if you do that with honeybees, changing it to make pseudo-drones, which is like homos with intercaste doings, then what are we doing when we have people taking different hormones with pharmaceuticals being sold, and you wonder why they think women are men, men are women, or whatever is going on. And the same with cattle, and here's all the plants homogenized, and does that change the pollination as to how the pollen works for infusing, for making fruit and all the seeds and plants grow? So you got a lot to think about. Okay, productive colonies require large quantities of pollen and honey throughout the year. Each colony requires 40 to 60 pounds of pollen and several hundred pounds of honey for rearing brood and feeding the adult population. But where is that taught? Because anymore, as soon as you see it, they want to take it and feed the slop with the sugar syrup, the high fructose corn syrup, which has no vitamins, minerals, nutrients for life going on. Okay, 5, ample reserves of pollen and honey can make the colonies practically independent of weather conditions. And this has been taught, and I've got the paperwork on it done decades ago, that with sufficient pollen and honey and hives kept adult size and not as babies as taught today for one and two little nukes thinking they're hives, bees can survive temperatures well over 130, 140 degrees, but they can go well to below 60, if not 100, 120 degrees below zero. And I've got the paperwork on it, formally done decades ago. But it's not taught anymore. Okay, a group of colonies that differ in population, brood rearing, hive space organization, and other colony factors can express great difference in the level of the honey flow with access to the same nectar flow. What does that mean? It means there's a division of labor. Babies need more help. They don't work as hard because they have to have people overseeing them. Just like when we have babies, you have to take care of the kids. There's, one's prior to school with the diapers and all the stuff. You're going to school, you're learning. As you get learning more and you get older, you get more independent. You're working, you're doing more. And then all of a sudden you have a capacity to live independently and on your own. Well, it's the same with bees, but it's relative to the size of the colony, the amount of bees in the hive for doing the work. And without enough of what we used to call critical mass, which is the number of bees, if you have just enough to barely feed, you have to keep feeding because life comes first. Once you get enough numbers for excess, then you can do house cleaning duties. You can do water carrying duties, you can do going for pollen, you can go for honey and nectar. You can do a whole lot of things then, taking care of pests and parasites, but you gotta have the dynamics and the hive growth and size to do it properly. And that's all basics. Okay. 7, a prolific queen will require the equivalent of from 12 to 18 standard combs, depending on the amount of honey and pollen, though theoretically all of her brood could be contained in 5 to 6 combs. And we're talking deeps here, completely laid up top to bottom, side to side, but spread out where it's got honey and pollen around the brood in a lot of areas. It can be double that because the bees are using it for food, for feeding close, so they're not going as far in the hive back and forth, but it's also an insulation factor against heat and cold. Okay, 8, 1 pound of pollen will permit the rearing of about 4,500 bees. Okay?
How much pollen, if you have a full frame, like almost completely full of pollen, how many pounds is that? A couple?
Not that much. Probably 2 or 3. So if you're figuring you're eating constantly where you have your 17 to 21 day rotation cycle, and it takes how much to raise a couple of frames to get 4,500 bees. You see what I'm saying? You're going through 5 pounds easily, if not 10, if you've got 10 or 12. See what I'm saying? Every single month. They're doing a lot of work getting that, and yet there's people putting pollen traps on, taking it from them, feeding the artificial stuff, and wondering, why are my bees sick? Now, would they do that? Have you seen that done? Probably. But would I put that out? Yes, because if we're going to go organic, you want that artificial junk making them sicker. You want them independent, getting to adult size so they can really roll for it. Okay. 9, hand-to-mouth feeding may keep hives of bees alive, but seldom contributes to strong colonies capable of producing maximum crops. 10, cakes of pollen supplement can be fed to advantage starting 6 weeks prior to new pollen collection, which means in the winter time, you have an odd winter, it's warmer where they're consuming more. Or you're in a dearth and there's nothing blooming and there's less available. Okay, you see a bloom coming on because you're seeing the buds, you're seeing stuff starting to green up. Well, to have them ahead of the flow, which is 6 to 8 weeks where you have to mimic nature for being able to get the pollen, to bring it home, to store it, to get beyond the feeding routine, you can't feed them pollen no more than 6 or 8 weeks, but it's also been proven after 6 or 8 weeks, artificial stuff is detrimental, the bees go downhill. But yet if you have real pollen stored back, and you can give them the real stuff, which is why I say make some real pollen paddies, mix it with real honey, they'll come on, they'll be strong, they'll go out, they'll forage, they'll sock it in, and once you're fed normally, you're okay and good to go, don't have to do it again until another dearth or something strange comes on in another 3 to 5 year cycle. If you can follow what I'm saying. Now, 11. Propolis used by bees to naturally combat fungal, viral, and bacterial infections, as well as sterilize the brood nest for egg laying by the queen. And it's not that it actually kills, it's that it puts the stuff in a working balance more too. And that's where a lot more research needs to be done on it for what's being done. Because propolis is a resin, it's called the sap of life of the plants. It's the living blood of the plants that the bees bring back. But if bees are cold-blooded, we've all evolved out of the same basic stuff billions of years ago, and then things split where we have white blood cells just like we have red blood cells, our white being what combats the bacteria, the fungal, and everything else, which is similar to plants. And propolis is the sap, that's the residue from it. It has to interrelate, and we need a lot more research on that. So I'm glad Marshall's here. Okay, Marshall, raise your hand.
On the market, the pollen patties are 4% pollen. What would you recommend as the percentage of pollen?
100% real, which you take from your own bees, which you can do with a few odd traps, hold it aside. You always work with the real stuff, because man's artificial stuff is not real. It's just game playing.
The other important thing about pollen is the protein percent.
You're right.
It seems to be that if the protein percent is too low, it doesn't matter where it comes from, it's no good.
Tell me about it, and how do you get your muscles to flex, work, or even fly if bees have to use their wing muscles and everything else for flying? How can you go long distances in dearths or anything, 8-10 miles, that nature can do with strong colonies out in the feral that are never robbed by us people, unless we're out, you know, whatever. But you can't have the artificial stuff that's only a small percentage, because you end up, it's like putting the bees in a wheelchair after a while. You can't work if you don't have the strength and the tone to do it with. Okay, wax moths can cause bee misshapen wings along with ants and viral infections. And people say it's deformed wing virus. Yeah, but a lot of things cause deformed wing virus, from being chilled to ants, moths, you know, and stuff is coming out and they're being predicated upon. Ants can cause much bee paralysis along with various viral infections. But they talk it's the mites. Well, what happened to all the ant problems, and how much are still ant problems, and the guys looking at it don't know what they're looking at to separate it for what's going on. The size of drone cells built by bees always bears a constant ratio to the size of the worker cells in the colony. And if drone cell size starts in nature 5.4 to 5.5, and then why do we have hives that act strange at times? Well, it also brings the mites and the parasites in because you're not in line with nature for what true females are, just like most animals, bigger and hybridized, are eating all these wrong nutrients. All of a sudden they're working between male and female casts, and they're all screwed up like we have many humans anymore with hormones you have to take, so you got these big muscles that mean what? Besides changing other parts of your body, not that I'd say that. Okay, the drone cell has a volume double that of the worker bee cell. But in doubling the volume, it changes the consistency of the royal jelly that's fed to get them bigger. And in changing that, you get more juvenile growth hormone. And the juvenile growth hormone is the trigger factor that comes in for getting mites and pests going. But that's not really taught, although we talk about it here. And the bee by other name is still a bee, perceived by others, parasiting on it only as a basic food source. So question, through your management, are you raising pseudo-drones with your workers by having them on drone-sized comb or bigger, or do you have them real females that go out, used to handle all the gardening like our pioneer settlers did centuries ago, while the guys were out fighting, doing all the guarding and the protecting, with each having their own line of duty, and then they'd come in and work together with the women, where they'd go out, pick the food, can it, bring it in, and then guys would build stuff, women would take care of the house, or they'd work together with, like in beekeeping, the guys would cut the wood, the woman would nail it together, or they'd do something else. You just figure out your own division of labor, but at least you're doing something. So through your management, are you weakening your bees with standard diets and medical chemical treatments? So if you do the artificial feeding and all the treatments with your acids, dopes, waters, and everything else, what are you doing to your bees? I imagine Pixie just walked out, but I'm not going to say nothing. Because he's got to have the real stuff for having for the bees. Okay, basic concepts relative to Varroa. Let's go into some of that before we get into some of this other stuff I want to do here. The selection of appropriate cell is the utmost important to the mite and ultimately affects both the rate of mite population increase and damage to individual bees and to the colony as a whole. It's been demonstrated that the mite prefers drone brood to worker brood for reproduction. Serrana bees, Africanized bees, bees on a natural system, which is what Africanized bees are, because they're, quote, naturally sized from a third world country, versus our industrialized countries like in the USA or Europe that have been hybridizing bigger for 135 years now, so that the people having problems doing all the dopes and treatments are on a comb size that's 5.4 or 5.5, which is drone size theoretically, or bigger equivalent in nature, and then they wonder why they're sick. Not that I'd say that. On a natural system, generally about 40% of the drone cells are infested, while for workers, the average is close to 10%. But if what goes in never reproduces, there's never a problem with the workers. And normally, it's the drone cells where they reproduce. And then normally, even with mites, it's not more than 1 or 2. If you're on the old 5.5 natural size, for where the drone line crosses. But then we've got bigger drones anymore because the stuff's been upsized 40 to 60%. And several substances have been tested for their effect on mite presence in hives and in the laboratories. juvenile hormone, the blood of a drone larva, which is the HEMOLMPH stuff, drone larval extract in water, methyl, acetone. You have your drone larva and food from drone larva. But I wouldn't say that they take the drone larva and stir it up and just try and say, here, you know. Our government don't do that. Only food from drone larvae tested in the hive gave positive results. Testing done, and the testing was done with Africanized bees in Brazil, which only meant in the beginning, the bees that were brought in by Dr. Kerr and that, which was done properly, were from the continent of Africa. Bees taken from the USA to Europe or South America or other countries with people buying them technically are, what would you call them? American bees. Bees that come here from Europe, we call European bees anymore, although technically, depending on the country they're from, they're Carniolan, Italian. There's Aphis mellifera, there's Caucasian from your Caucasus Mountains around the Black Sea, and that, depending on the area, they'd have a specific name for their geographical area. But continent-wise, the only ones that get a big name anymore are Africanized from the continent of Africa or Europeanized from Europe. USA bees? No, we don't put up with that here, do we?
Should we call them Americanized?
Well, sure, why not?
I mean,
But then we have to tell the difference between Americanized for what? North American bees, South American bees? We got to break it down.
well, aren't there many different subspecies of African bees?
What's Africanized if they're just native bees? Why don't we call them Brazilian bees, Argentina bees? See what I'm saying? Panama Canal bees, Nicaragua, or whatever, like they do in Europe, or they used to do.
Well, it's kind of like the not just sweet thing. It's like how many generations does it have to be here before it becomes native?
Well,
I mean, at one point everything was invasive.
if it's here and it'll work with nature, normally it's there within a few decades, within 100 years. You know what I mean? It doesn't take long. And with men and women going around the world for millions of years, the same plants that grow in the Mediterranean grow in the USA in the same latitude and longitudes. And it goes around and bands around the world with all your animals, all your plants, all your trees with relative stuff. They might look similar, they're all similar looking, but still by their geographic area there are little differences because of the way the sun, the moon, the water, and all your, you know, your life is. But who puts that together anymore? Now, it says it's a known fact that honeybees and mice have been on this earth and coexisted for millions of years. Parasites cannot survive if they kill their host. And it's like, what have we done to throw the natural harmony with life out of balance to make all the stuff that was cleaning the hairs, like on cattle, that used to be mites grooming the hairs on the backs of the bees. So all of a sudden they're predicating. Well, we made the bees bigger. That's the only thing that man has done, and that started with the Hitler times with the wanting to make all the fruits and vegetables bigger with the first Great Depression that most of our people went through with our grandfathers. They wanted more food, so they had to make the plants bigger. But that ain't more food. It's just that they needed more people to plow and do more work, and it was easier for the ones that had it to make the stuff bigger than to get more people to want to work.
Well, they didn't foresee the fact that they're breeding the nutrition out of the plant, so really we ended up with less nutrition.
We shot ourselves in the foot, is what we did. Now here's 1908. for history. It says several times it's been suggested that we enlarge the race of honeybees by giving them larger cells. And some circumstances seem to indicate that something may be done in this direction, although I have little hope any permanent enlargement in size unless we combine it with the area of selecting the largest bees to propagate from as given a few pages back, and it goes on. And then it goes on saying in other editions on how they have to do it in waves, because if they do it all at once, people are going to say, what the hell's happened? And then want to revert back. So every 15, 20 bees, there was a slight upsizing in size. So that's 4 or 6 different upsizings now. And finally, all the problems are connected because enough damage was done with the enlargement to make for serious problems. But this was written back in 1909, and no offense, this is ABCXYZ with the bee culture stuff. Here's a basic history on comb size. It's the beginning of the 20th century. And you can just read through it. But here's Hubbard, 1791, using drone comb for the queen to lay workers in. I know Michael Bush probably knows what I'm doing about because he did a lot of translation on that.
What is the reference for this? I just want to be able to use this. ABC?
Okay, now this is different here. This is just me putting basics together. First investigation was done by Hubbard in 1791. Moss invaded the first hive he used for the queen to lay workers in and killed it. After laying a little in the second hive, the queen absconded. By grafting the worker bee larva into drone cells, after removing the drone larva, he finally succeeded. But he had to take the drone larva out, like you take queen larva out of the worker cells to make queen cells. Well, he did that artificially to make the other, but anyway, he was one of those that had a lot, but he was a real intelligent person. There's 1925, Mikolov determined that bees reared in drone cells were larger than their worker cell sisters and drew some conclusions. Workers weighed more, the tongue of the bee is longer, the wings is longer and wider, but there were no difference in the average number of wing hooks on the bee. The greater tongue length made beekeepers believe that the bees had a greater storage ability for honey. It's because of the longer tongue, they probably had bigger guts because they had everything else bigger. In spite of the fact that there was little scientific research to prove this idea. And then Merle in 22, Hudson in 26 showed that there was no correlation between the length of the bee's tongue and honey stored. And actually, it's the difference between fighters and bombers flying, the number of trips being flown, forgetting how many trips of honey and nectar home versus a bigger animal has to have more food to feed all the body parts. And it's putting all the pieces together. But this is where all the stuff started, and then you start going down through history, reading more and more, which you can do in the old books. But how many people know enough to start reading this and looking for it in the different libraries to get their minds going like, oh shit, what the hell have they done to us? Now, ending here, Foundation having 850 cells per square decimeter is the old world standard. Well, that's about an 8.3. And you hear about Langstroth writing about the 4.748 range. Well, the 4.748 are the old standards. Foundation having 800 cells per square inch is the old standard. Enlarged 700 side, achieved by Bordeaux, approximates comb honey foundation used in this country, dates from 1927. although introduced in the US around 1962. And that's because after World War II, we had to catch up with Europe, so what was over there and they were doing there, since Bordeaux is over with the Netherlands and in conjunction with France and all of Europe and all the stuff where they were, we had to bring all that modern stuff here. But look what it did to our country. That we gotta fix, and they still gotta fix worldwide. And by 1913, it was a known fact that bees will not use cone measuring 3.5 cells to the inch, but they're sure trying it now with the Apis dorsum. They're trying to get things bigger. But I'm not going to go into who would want to do the Apis dorsum a bit. But are they trying? Yeah. But I'm going to stop. And as for the honey, pollen, propolis, and all the other stuff, comb measuring basics, which I have here, where I could go on and on and on and talk. Mark, I want you to come up front. I want Joe to come up front. Is Joe here?
Just stepped out.
Well, you better go out and find them. Go out and get them. Because people that came here that want to learn real beekeeping, I'm going to get a few people that like to talk that I think might know something. And we're going to get some discussion going back and forth. The old way, the way it used to be done at clubs, so people would help people. And if you got a question, raise your hand. You got a problem, we'll talk it out. And it's for bringing things together. Joe, you better come up front. We're going to put an old panel together.
Dee,
Uh-huh.
could you put the basic concepts of the Varroa back up? That guy, want to take a couple more notes, or you can grab it.
You can come and grab it from me. Or you can wait till we're done. I mean, it's going to be here all day.
Okay, awesome.
Breeding, proper breeding is what proper breeding.
Okay, we got Joe, we got Mark. Who else wants to sit up here that can talk bees? That's serious. How many hives you have?
Currently?
Yeah.
About a dozen.
Got 12.
I have had up to 40.
What?
I've had up to 40.
Really? How many you have, Mark?
4 apiaries and about 16 hives.
Okay. I know Joe's got bees. Who else here? I mean, anybody here have a couple of hundred, 200 or 300? Not Michael. Sit down.
Can talk bees.